The Montana winter of 1887 showed no mercy to those unprepared for its bitter embrace. Snow fell like judgment from a colorless sky, burying Pine Creek Valley under a blanket of silent white. In a small cottage at the edge of Silverwood Ranch, Rebecca Miller huddled beside the dying embers of her fireplace, her daughter Emma's small body pressed against hers for warmth. They had been given 3 days to vacate the property, 3 days since her husband Daniel had been laid to rest in the frozen ground. The pantry held enough food for perhaps another week. The woodpile outside had dwindled to nearly nothing, and her in-laws, the wealthy Miller family who owned the sprawling ranch beyond her window, had made it painfully clear. Daniel's widow and child were no longer their concern. "What happens when the food is gone, Mama?" Emma whispered, her 8-year-old voice trembling like the last leaf on an autumn branch. Rebecca pulled her daughter closer, fighting back tears that would only freeze on her cheeks. "God provides, little one," she whispered back. "God provides." But as the wind howled through the poorly sealed windows of their cottage, Rebecca wondered if even God could hear them through the storm. She had no family of her own to turn to, no money, and the nearest town was 5 miles away through snowdrifts that would swallow a horse whole. What she couldn't know, was that someone was watching the cottage from the edge of the pines. Someone who had long ago turned his back on humanity, but who still remembered what it meant to be human. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Miller had not always lived in fear. 4 years earlier, she had arrived in Pine Creek Valley as a mail-order bride, with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and hope blooming in her heart like wildflowers after spring rain. Daniel Miller had written to her for months, gentle, thoughtful letters that spoke of his dreams to build something of his own, separate from his family's wealth and influence. Their courtship through ink and paper had given Rebecca, a schoolteacher from Ohio with no prospects and no parents, the courage to journey west. "You bring the knowledge, I'll provide the land," Daniel had written in his final letter before her arrival. "Together, we'll build something that matters." And for a time, they had. Their cottage, though modest, had been filled with laughter. Emma had been born a year after their wedding, arriving on a summer morning as golden as her hair would eventually become. Daniel had worked the small parcel of land his father had begrudgingly given them as a wedding present, while Rebecca had taught not only Emma, but several of the ranch hands' children to read and write. The whispers had started almost immediately. Martha Miller, her mother-in-law, had never hidden her disdain for the bookish Easterner who had stolen her youngest son. George Miller, the family patriarch, had merely tolerated Rebecca's presence, referring to her education as unnecessarily ornamental for a rancher's wife. Only Daniel had defended her, standing between Rebecca and his family like a bulwark against a rising tide. "They'll come around," he'd promised, kissing her forehead. "In the privacy of their bedroom. They just need time to see what I see." But time had run out. The influenza that swept through the valley had taken Daniel in just 3 days, from healthy to feverish to still. Rebecca had barely processed his final breath before George Miller appeared at her door, his face as weathered and unforgiving as the mountain range that bordered their land to the west. "The cottage and land were Daniel's," he'd said, hat in hand but eyes cold. "Now they're mine again. I'll give you until the end of the week to make arrangements." Rebecca had stared at him, still wearing the apron stained with the broth she'd been feeding Daniel hours before. "What arrangements? I have nowhere to go. Emma has nowhere to go. We're family." George Miller had placed his hat back on his head, adjusting it with practiced precision. "No, ma'am. You were Daniel's wife. That obligation died with my son." Now, 3 days later, Rebecca stood at the window of the cottage, watching the snow fall with increasing ferocity. Her fingers traced the outline of Daniel's last letter, carried in her pocket like a talisman. She had written to the sheriff in Riverdale, pleading for intervention, but knew the miller's influence extended throughout the county. The local minister had offered sympathetic words, but little else. The women from neighboring homesteads, who had attended Daniel's funeral, had brought food but avoided her eyes, unwilling to cross the powerful Miller family. In the corner of the room, Emma sat with her doll, whispering secrets into its cloth ear. The sight broke Rebecca's heart anew. Her daughter was already learning that the world could be cruel, that promises could be as fragile as ice on a spring pond. "We'll leave tomorrow," Rebecca said softly, more to herself than to Emma. "We'll pack what we can carry and walk to Riverdale if necessary." Even as she spoke the words, Rebecca knew it was nearly impossible. The snow was halfway up the door. Already, the journey that took 2 hours by wagon in good weather would be a death sentence on foot in a blizzard, especially for a child. As darkness fell, Rebecca stoked what remained of their fire, adding the smallest log she could find from their dwindling supply. She served Emma a meager dinner of beans and the last of their bread, setting aside nothing for herself. When her daughter was tucked into bed, Rebecca finally allowed her tears to fall, silent and hot against her palms. "What would you have me do, Daniel?" she whispered to the empty room. "How do I save her?" Outside, the wind's howl was her only answer. Until it wasn't. A sharp knock at the door startled Rebecca so badly she nearly overturned the chair she was sitting in. No one should be out in this weather, and certainly no one would come calling at this hour. Her heart pounding, Rebecca approached the door. "Who's there?" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. "Jack Thornton, ma'am," came the reply, barely audible through the wooden door and the storm's fury. "I've brought wood for your fire." Rebecca hesitated. Jack Thornton. The name was familiar, but only as a whisper, a story told to frighten children. The recluse who lived deep in Blackwood Hills. The man who hadn't set foot in Riverdale for nearly a decade, who traded pelts for supplies through intermediaries, but never showed his face. "Why would you bring us wood?" Rebecca asked, still not opening the door. There was a pause before the voice answered. "Because it's cold, and you have a child." The simplicity of the answer, stripped of pretense or expectation, made Rebecca's decision for her. She unlatched the door and pulled it open, gasping as the wind nearly knocked her backwards. The man standing on her porch was tall and broad-shouldered, his face largely hidden by a snow-crusted beard and the fur-lined hood of his coat. Behind him stood a sturdy mountain horse, steam rising from its nostrils, pulling a small sledge piled high with split firewood. "Mr. Thornton," Rebecca said, suddenly conscious of her tear-stained face and rumpled dress, "I don't understand." Jack Thornton's eyes, startlingly blue against his weather-beaten face, met hers briefly before looking away. "Don't need to understand. Wood's getting wet. Best bring it in." His voice was rough, as if unaccustomed to use. Too exhausted and desperate to argue, Rebecca stepped aside. For the next 20 minutes, she watched as this stranger methodically stacked firewood beside her hearth, moving with efficient purpose between the sledge and the cottage, saying nothing more than necessary. When he had finished, the pile reached nearly to her ceiling, more wood than the millers had provided for her all winter. "That should last a few weeks," Jack said, brushing snow from his coat at the threshold. He reached into a satchel and produced a package wrapped in oilcloth. "Venison smoked, keeps well." Rebecca accepted the package, its weight substantial in her hands. "Mr. Thornton, I have no way to pay you." Something that might have been a smile flickered beneath his beard. "Didn't ask for payment." "Then why?" The question escaped before Rebecca could contain it. Jack Thornton looked past her to where Emma had appeared in the bedroom doorway, sleep-tousled and curious. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Heard about Daniel? Heard about what George Miller said?" He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "Not right, leaving a woman and child to the cold. Not right at all." Before Rebecca could respond, he had turned and was trudging back to his horse. At the edge of the porch, he stopped and spoke without turning. "Storm's getting worse. If you need help getting to town, I'll come back tomorrow." Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow, leaving Rebecca standing in the doorway with venison in her hands and confusion in her heart. That night, for the first time since Daniel's death, the cottage was warm. Rebecca lay awake long after Emma had fallen asleep, listening to the wind and replaying the strange encounter in her mind. Jack Thornton was not at all what the stories had painted him to be. Not a wild man, not dangerous, not touched in the head as Martha Miller had once claimed. He was, Rebecca realized, simply alone as she was now. Morning brought a brief respite from the storm and a knock at the door that Rebecca half expected. Jack stood on her porch, his horse and sledge behind him, his expression unreadable. "Storm's passing," he said without preamble. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Road to town will be clear by midday. I can take you if you're still planning to go." Rebecca had spent the night weighing her options, each as bleak as the last. "The Millers have made it clear we're not welcome here. But I have nowhere in Riverdale to stay. No money for a room." Jack shifted his weight, eyes on the distant mountains. "You have options besides Riverdale, such as my cabin." The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. He hurried on. "It's small but solid. Separate room you and the girl could use, just until spring, just until you figure things out." Rebecca stared at him, searching for any hint of impropriety or threat, finding none. "Why would you do this for strangers, Mr. Thornton?" Jack's gaze finally met hers, and in his eyes, Rebecca saw not pity, but a profound understanding of loss. "I know what it is to have nowhere to go. No one should face that, especially not a child." Emma appeared beside Rebecca, looking up at the large man with curiosity rather than fear. "Do you have books at your cabin, mister?" Jack blinked, clearly unprepared for the question. "Some old ones. Haven't read them in years." "I can read them to you," Emma offered solemnly. "Mama taught me how. I'm very good." Something in Jack's face changed then, a softening around the eyes, a tension releasing. "Would like that," he said quietly. As Rebecca watched this exchange, a decision crystallized within her. The Millers had abandoned them to die. This stranger, this recluse feared by the valley, had offered them life. "We accept your offer, Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice steady despite the fear fluttering in her chest. "Just until spring." Jack nodded once, the gesture containing neither triumph nor celebration, merely acknowledgement. "Pack what matters, leave the rest. We should go before they realize my sledge made these tracks." 2 hours later, Rebecca stood in the doorway of the cottage where she'd been both blissfully happy and devastatingly broken. Emma was already settled on the sledge, wrapped in blankets, her doll clutched to her chest, a few books secured in a sack. "Ready, Mrs. Miller?" Jack asked, holding the reins of his patient horse. Rebecca took one last look at the home she had shared with Daniel. "Rebecca," she said, "if we're to share a roof, even temporarily, you should call me Rebecca." Jack nodded, the barest hint of warmth in his eyes. "Rebecca, then." As they moved away from the cottage, Rebecca didn't look back. She couldn't have known that Martha Miller watched from an upstairs window of the main house, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Nor could she have known that George Miller had already drafted a letter to the sheriff claiming theft of property, or that Andrew Miller, Daniel's brother, had argued against his parents' treatment of his brother's widow, only to be silenced with threats of disinheritance. All Rebecca knew was that the path ahead, winding up toward Blackwood Hills, represented something she had nearly lost forever: possibility. Jack's cabin appeared as they crested a ridge, nestled among towering pines, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was larger than Rebecca had expected, built of solid logs with a workshop attached to one side and what appeared to be a small stable to the other. A stream, partially frozen, gurgled nearby. "It's not much," Jack said as he helped Emma down from the sledge, "but the roof doesn't leak and the walls keep out the wind." Rebecca surveyed the clearing, noting the careful organization of tools, the well-maintained woodpile, the absence of the disorder she had half expected from a man living alone in the wilderness. "It's more than we had yesterday," she said simply. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its fire burning steadily. A wooden table and chairs stood in the center of the main room. Shelves lined another wall, holding an unexpected number of books. A doorway led to what Jack explained was now their room. He would sleep in the main area. "Used to be my workshop. Inside, before I built the addition," he explained, showing them the bedroom that contained a sturdy bed, a small chest, and a window overlooking the valley below. "Haven't used this room in years." Emma immediately went to the window, pressing her nose against the glass. "I can see forever from here," she breathed. Rebecca turned to Jack, finding him watching her daughter with an expression of such gentle sorrow that it made her chest ache. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "Don't need thanks," Jack interrupted, his gruffness returning. "Need to check the traps before dark. Make yourselves at home." When he had gone, Rebecca sat heavily on the edge of the bed, the events of the past days crashing over her like waves. They were safe, for now. They were warm. They had food. But they were also completely dependent on the kindness of a man she knew nothing about, living miles from the nearest neighbor, with the powerful Miller family undoubtedly furious at their disappearance. Emma climbed onto the bed beside her mother. "I like Mr. Jack," she said, leaning her golden head against Rebecca's shoulder. "He looks scary, but his eyes are kind, like that stray dog Daniel used to feed, remember?" Rebecca smiled despite herself. "Yes, I remember." She hugged her daughter close. "We'll be fine here just until spring. Then we'll figure out what comes next." But as the winter days began to pass, Rebecca found herself wondering if what came next was already unfolding in this cabin on the mountainside, with this man who spoke little but whose actions resonated louder than any words. Days stretched into weeks on the mountainside. January yielded reluctantly to February, bringing shorter nights but deeper snows. The rhythm of life in Jack Thornton's cabin was unlike anything Rebecca had known before, governed not by social obligations or town clocks, but by sunlight, necessity, and the quiet partnership that had developed between them. Each morning, Rebecca woke before dawn to find the fire already stoked, fresh coffee brewing, and Jack often gone, checking traps, hunting, or simply walking the perimeter of his property like a sentinel. She would prepare breakfast from their modest but sufficient supplies, and when Emma awakened, they would eat together, saving a portion for Jack's return. The cabin, which had seemed Spartan at first glance, revealed itself to be ingeniously designed for mountain living. Shelves hidden beneath benches held preserved fruits and vegetables. A trapdoor in the floor concealed a small root cellar where potatoes, carrots, and apples kept cool but unfrozen. Rain barrels connected to wooden. Gutters collected snow that melted gradually in the warmth of the south-facing windows, providing water when the nearby stream froze solid. "Did you build all this yourself?" Rebecca asked one evening as Jack repaired a split in one of his snowshoes by the firelight. He nodded, fingers working the sinew with practiced ease. Took 7 years. Started with just a lean-to over there. He gestured vaguely toward the eastern wall. Added a piece at a time. Rebecca watched his methodical movements, the way his large hands managed such delicate work. You must have been very young when you came here. Something flickered across Jack's face, a shadow of memory. 23, not so young. The war. Rebecca ventured, recalling that Jack appeared to be in his early 40s now, which would place his arrival in these mountains shortly after the Civil War. Jack's hands stilled momentarily. Part of it. He offered nothing more, and Rebecca didn't press. She was learning that Jack's silences were not rejections, merely boundaries to be respected. Instead, she returned to her mending, repairing a tear in Emma's woolen stockings while her daughter slept in the bedroom they shared. The quiet between them was comfortable now, unlike the awkward tension of their first days together. Rebecca had worried initially about impropriety, about depending on a stranger's charity, about what the future held. But those concerns had gradually been replaced by more immediate ones. Teaching Emma her letters, using the snow as a slate when paper was scarce. Learning to set rabbit snares under Jack's patient instruction. Discovering how to bank the fire properly to last through the coldest nights. "Why did you really take us in?" Rebecca asked after several minutes of companionable silence. It was a question that had lingered in her mind since that snowy night at the cottage. Jack continued his work without looking up. "Told you already. You said you knew what it was to have nowhere to go." Rebecca set her mending aside. "But there's more, isn't there?" Jack's hands finally stilled. He stared into the fire for a long moment, his profile carved in light and shadow. "Had a sister once. Younger. After our parents died, we had different paths. I went to war. She married." He swallowed visibly. "Her husband wasn't kind. When I came back, she was gone. Neighbors said she just disappeared one winter. Her and her little boy." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "Jack, I'm so sorry. Never found out what happened, but I always thought..." He stopped, his jaw working. "Always thought maybe if someone had noticed, had offered help." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of years of regret. "When I saw you and Emma at that cottage, with the Millers turning their backs..." He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Rebecca understood with sudden clarity. In saving them, Jack was trying to save the sister he couldn't help all those years ago. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. "And thank you for seeing us." Jack nodded once, returning to his snowshoe. Repair, but something had shifted between them. A door opened just enough to let in a sliver of light. The following morning, when Rebecca awoke, she found Jack teaching Emma how to whittle a small piece of pine into the shape of a rabbit. Her daughter's tongue was caught between her teeth in concentration, her small hands guided by Jack's weathered buns. Neither noticed Rebecca watching from the bedroom doorway, and she didn't interrupt. The sight of Emma's delighted smile when Jack praised her careful cut was worth more than any social convention that might have been breached by their unusual arrangement. As February deepened, however, their peaceful routine was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Rebecca was hanging freshly washed clothes near the fire when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze. Jack, who had been showing Emma how to identify animal tracks in a book, was on his feet instantly, reaching for the rifle that hung above the door. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and tense. "Both of you." Through the frost-edged window, Rebecca watched as Sheriff Tom Cooper dismounted from his horse, his expression grim beneath his snow-dusted hat. Jack stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. "Thornton," the sheriff nodded. "Been a while." "Cooper," Jack returned, evenly. "What brings you up this far?" "Looking for Rebecca Miller and her daughter," The sheriff stamped his feet against the cold. "George Miller's raising hell down in the valley. Says they took off with family property, valuable items." Rebecca's heart pounded against her ribs. She hadn't taken anything that wasn't rightfully hers. Just clothes, Emma's toys, Daniel's letters, and a few small keepsakes. "That's so." Jack's voice betrayed nothing. Sheriff Cooper sighed, his breath clouding in the cold air. "Look, Jack, I know you and I have had our differences, but I'm not here to cause trouble. I've got George Miller breathing down my neck, threatening to involve the territorial governor if I don't find his daughter-in-law." "And if you found her?" Jack asked, still blocking the cabin door. "I'd have to hear her side." Cooper shook his head. "Doesn't take a genius to figure out why a woman and child might flee the Millers after Daniel's passing. Martha Miller's got a tongue like a skinning knife, and George's heart froze over sometime around 65. Rebecca moved to the door then, her decision made. "I'm here, Sheriff," she said, stepping onto the porch beside Jack, "and I've stolen nothing." Cooper's expression softened at the sight of her. "Mrs. Miller, relieved to see you're well. Folks in town were worried when you disappeared." "Were they?" Rebecca couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "None seemed concerned when George Miller gave me 3 days to vacate my home with my child in the dead of winter." The sheriff removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Not everyone approves of how the Millers handled things, but few stand against George in public. Will you force us to return?" Rebecca asked, feeling Jack tense beside her. Cooper studied her for a long moment, then let his gaze drift to the cabin behind her, to Emma's face peering cautiously through the window, to Jack's protective stance. "No, ma'am, I won't. The law doesn't require a widow to live with her in-laws, especially when no formal guardianship was established." Relief flooded through Rebecca, but it was short-lived. "That said," the sheriff continued, "George Miller is claiming some items of value were taken. Family heirlooms, he says. A silver mirror, some jewelry that belonged to his wife's mother. Says they were on loan to Daniel's household." "That's a lie," Rebecca said firmly. "The only silver in that cottage was my mother's thimble, which she left to me before she died. Everything else belonged to Daniel and me, purchased with his earnings." Cooper nodded slowly. "I thought as much. But George Miller isn't a man who accepts being thwarted. He's already filed papers in Riverdale claiming rights to anything of value that was in the cottage, based on the fact that the land and building were technically his property. So he takes our home and then claims our possessions too." Rebecca's hands clenched at her sides. "It's not right," Cooper agreed, "but it's technically legal. The house was his to reclaim. Without a proper will from Daniel." Jack, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "What does he really want, Cooper? George Miller doesn't need Rebecca's mother's thimble or Daniel's books." The sheriff met Jack's gaze steadily. "You know as well as I do. Control. The Millers don't like losing anything they consider theirs, and they especially don't like being embarrassed. Word spread about how they treated Daniel's widow. Some of the church ladies have been openly critical. Maggie Wilson refused to extend credit to Martha at the Mercantile last week." "So this is about pride," Rebecca said quietly. "Partly." Cooper settled his hat back on his head. "But there's more. Andrew Miller was in my office yesterday, separate from his father, said to tell you that Daniel had a life insurance policy. Not large, but enough to support you and Emma for a while. Policy was with a company in Helena. Papers are in the safe at Riverdale Bank." Rebecca stared at the sheriff, stunned. "I didn't know." "According to Andrew, Daniel set it up last year without telling his parents, only told his brother in case something happened." Cooper glanced at Jack. "That money is legally yours, Mrs. Miller, but to claim it, you'd need to come to Riverdale, sign papers at the bank, and George Miller knows that." "It's a trap," Jack said flatly. Cooper didn't disagree. George can't force you to return to the cottage legally, but if you come to town for the insurance money, he'll be waiting. And he's got Judge Parker in his pocket. What would happen? Rebecca asked, her throat tight. Best case, he causes delays, legal challenges, tries to drain the insurance money through lawyers' fees. The sheriff's expression darkened. Worst case, he petitions for guardianship of Emma, claiming you're unfit. Living unchaperoned with a man not your husband would be his first exhibit. Jack's knuckles whitened on his rifle. That's not what this is. I know that, Cooper said, but mud sticks, especially to a widow's reputation, and George Miller has plenty to throw. Rebecca felt ice forming in her veins that had nothing to do with the February cold. So I must choose between the money that could secure Emma's future and the risk of losing her entirely. There might be another way, the sheriff said slowly. Andrew seemed genuinely troubled by his father's actions. Said he tried to argue against them but was shouted down. He's the bank manager now, you know. If someone not associated with you were to go to the bank with the proper documentation... His gaze shifted meaningfully to Jack, who stiffened. I haven't set foot in Riverdale for 9 years, Cooper. You know why. I do, the sheriff acknowledged. But times change. People's memories fade. And Andrew Miller strikes me as a man looking to right a wrong without directly opposing his father. Rebecca looked between the two men, sensing an undercurrent she didn't understand. What happened 9 years ago? Neither answered immediately. Finally, Jack turned to her, his expression guarded. Had a disagreement with some men in town. Got ugly. I left. Haven't been back. Sheriff Cooper snorted softly. That's one way to put it. 3 of Harlan Wade's logging crew cornered Jack outside the Pioneer, claimed he'd cheated at cards the night before, pulled knives. Jack put 2 in the doctor's office and 1 in the cemetery. Rebecca couldn't hide her shock. She glanced at Jack, this man who had been nothing but gentle with Emma, nothing but respectful toward her. It was self-defense, Cooper added, clear as day to anyone who saw it. But Harlan Wade had influence back then, and Jack didn't wait around for a fair hearing. Wasn't going to get one, Jack said quietly. Not then. Cooper nodded. Probably. True. But Wade died 3 years back. His logging operation went bust. Most of his crew moved on. He looked squarely at Jack. What I'm saying is, there might not be pitchforks and torches if you rode into town now. Especially if you came to the bank on legitimate business. Jack's jaw worked silently. Rebecca could see the conflict in his eyes, the instinct to protect, his solitude warring with the desire to help. Think about it, Cooper said, moving back toward his horse. I won't tell George Miller I found you. Far as I'm concerned, I tracked footprints that disappeared in the last storm. He mounted smoothly, despite the cold, but he won't stop looking. And sooner or later, when the snow melts enough for regular travel, someone else might find their way up here. After the sheriff departed, Rebecca and Jack stood in silence on the porch, watching until horse and rider disappeared among the trees. Finally, Rebecca turned to him. You don't have to do this. We've managed without the insurance money. We can continue to. Jack's eyes remained on the distant trees. How much schooling did Emma have before Daniel died? The question surprised Rebecca. Almost 2 years. I taught her myself and a few other children from the ranch. And when spring comes, summer, what then? Jack finally looked at her. You can't stay here forever, Rebecca. This isn't a life for you or for Emma. No school, no church, no other children. We could move somewhere else, start fresh, Rebecca suggested, though the thought of beginning again, with no resources, made her stomach clench. With what? Jack's voice was gentle but firm. That insurance money is Emma's future. It's what Daniel wanted for you both. Rebecca studied his face, seeing the resolve forming there. The sheriff said it was dangerous for you to go to town, that people might remember. Jack gave a short, humorless laugh. People always remember. Question is what they choose to do about it. He turned to go back inside, then paused. I'll leave at first light tomorrow. 2 days to town if the weather holds. 2 back. Jack, Rebecca caught his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath. His wool shirt. Thank you. Not just for this, but for everything. Something softened in his eyes. For a breathless moment, Rebecca thought he might cover her hand with his own. Instead, he nodded once and went inside to prepare for the journey. That night, after Emma was asleep, Rebecca sat alone by the fire, her thoughts churning like the snowflakes outside the window. Jack moved quietly around the cabin, gathering supplies, checking his gear, his actions precise and methodical. She watched him select a clean shirt, perhaps his only other one, and carefully pack it in an oilskin pouch. Do you need anything? From town? He asked, not looking up from his preparations. Besides the obvious, Rebecca considered. Thread, if you can find it. We're nearly out. And perhaps some paper for Emma to practice her letters. She's been using the margins of your books when she thinks I'm not looking. The corner of Jack's mouth twitched upward. Noticed that. Don't mind. He hesitated, then added, could look. For a primer, if Wilson's Mercantile has one. For her lessons. Rebecca smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. She'd like that. Jack nodded, continuing his preparations in silence. Rebecca knew she should retire, should leave him to his tasks. But something kept her rooted to her chair by the fire. Perhaps it was the uncertainty of what his journey might bring. Perhaps it was the realization of how much she had come to rely on his steady presence. Jack, she said finally, the sheriff said people might not remember what happened 9 years ago. But you don't believe that, do you? He paused in his work, staring down at the hunting knife he was sharpening. Some things don't wash away, not completely. What really happened that night? Rebecca asked softly. If you want to tell me. For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he set the knife aside and sat heavily in the chair opposite. Hers, the firelight casting deep shadows across his face. It wasn't about cards, he said quietly. Never played cards in the Pioneer or anywhere else in town. Wasn't about money either. He rubbed a hand across his beard. Was about Lily Wade. Harlan Wade's daughter. Rebecca had heard the name mentioned. In Riverdale when she first arrived, though she'd never met the girl. Jack nodded. She was 16, pretty, smart too. Wanted to be a teacher someday. His voice softened with the memory. Her father had other ideas. Promised her to one of his foremen, man twice her age, with hands like hammers and a temper to match. Lily didn't want it. Came to me because I sold pelts to her father, asked if I'd help her get to Helena where her aunt lived. Rebecca listened intently, beginning to understand. You tried to help her escape. Got her as far as the stagecoach station. Jack's eyes were distant now, seeing that night from 9 years past. Wade and his men caught up to us there. He'd been drinking, started shouting that I'd corrupted his daughter, that I was taking her for myself. His jaw tightened. Wasn't like that. Never touched that girl except to help her into the wagon. Daddy, what happened to Lily? Rebecca asked gently. Jack's expression darkened. Wade dragged her back home. 3 of his men followed me to the Pioneer, cornered me in the alley behind it. Said they were going to teach me what happened to men who interfered with another man's property. He looked down at his hands. I didn't want to fight. Told them to walk away. They didn't. The sheriff said it was self-defense. It was. Jack's voice was firm, but Wade had the judge in his pocket, same as George Miller does now. By morning, the story around town was that I'd tried to run off with Wade's underage daughter, killed a man when confronted. Didn't matter what the truth was. So you left, Rebecca finished for him. Jack nodded. Came up here, built this place. Figured it was better for everyone. What happened to Lily Wade? A ghost of a smile touched Jack's lips. Got a letter, once about 5 years back, smuggled up here by Maggie Wilson when she came to trade for pelts. Lily made it to Helena after all. Married a shopkeeper there, has 2 children now. He looked into the fire. Said to thank me if I ever got the chance. Rebecca found herself blinking back tears. She didn't forget. Neither should the town. Town remembers what it wants to, Jack said, rising from his chair. Always has. As he moved toward his bedroll near the fire, Rebecca caught his hand. The contact startled them both. His skin was rough with calluses, but warm, vital. Be careful in Riverdale, she said. Emma and I need you to come back. Something flickered in Jack's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper. He squeezed her hand briefly before releasing it. I'll come back, promise. Morning arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Jack was gone before Emma awoke, leaving only tracks in the fresh snow and a small wooden rabbit on the table. The perfect match to the one he'd been helping Emma whittle days before. Did Mr. Jack make this for me? Emma asked, her small fingers tracing the delicate ears. He did, Rebecca confirmed, fighting the worry that had settled in her chest since dawn. He's gone to town for a few days, but he'll be back soon. Emma nodded solemnly, tucking the wooden rabbit into her pocket. He'll come back? He promised me to last night when you were getting water. Said he never breaks a promise. Rebecca smiled, drawing her daughter close. Then we'll trust in that. But as the day progressed, she found herself returning again and again to the window that faced downslope toward Riverdale, wondering what reception awaited Jack Thornton in the town that had driven him into solitude years before. And beneath that worry lurked another, more troubling question. If Jack secured the insurance money, would he still want them to leave when spring arrived? The thought of departing the cabin, of leaving Jack to his solitude once more, created an ache in Rebecca's chest that she wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. Instead, she buried her concerns beneath activity, teaching Emma, preparing meals from their stores, keeping the cabin in order. But each creak of the wind, each distant sound from the forest brought her head up in expectation. 4 days passed with no sign of Jack's return. The weather remained clear, unnaturally so for February in Montana, offering no explanation for the delay. On the 5th morning, Rebecca was chopping vegetables for stew when Emma, who had been watching at the window, suddenly cried out, "Someone's coming, Mama, but it's not Mr. Jack!" Rebecca rushed to the window, her heart in her throat. Through the trees, she could make out 2 riders approaching, one on a bay horse she didn't recognize, the other on Jack's distinctive mountain gelding. "Emma, go to our room," she said quickly. "Stay there until I call for you." "But Mama, now Emma." Rebecca's tone brooked no argument. As her daughter reluctantly obeyed, Rebecca reached for Jack's spare rifle, which hung on pegs near the door. He had shown her how to use it for hunting during their weeks together, a skill she had never imagined needing before Daniel's death. Through the window, she watched the riders approach, her finger resting near but not on the trigger as Jack had taught her. As they drew closer, she recognized Andrew Miller on the bay horse, his city clothes ill-suited to mountain travel. Beside him, slumped forward slightly in the saddle, was Jack. Alive but clearly injured, a dark stain visible on his left side even from a distance. Rebecca flung open the door, the rifle forgotten in her hands. "Jack!" Andrew Miller raised a hand. In greeting, his expression grim. "Mrs. Miller, I've brought your friend home, though he's in need of attention." Rebecca barely heard him, her focus entirely on Jack, who was making a visible effort to straighten in the saddle. What happened? Was there trouble in town? Not in town. Andrew dismounted smoothly, moving to help Jack from his horse. On the road back, seems my father got wind of Mr. Thornton's business at the bank. Jack grimaced as his boots hit the ground, one hand pressed to his side. Ambush, he said through gritted teeth. 4 miles outside Riverdale, 3 men didn't recognize them. The hired hands, Andrew said, supporting Jack toward the cabin. Not ranch workers. Out-of-towners my father brought in specially, I'd wager. Rebecca's blood ran cold as she moved to Jack's other side, helping him up the porch steps. They were waiting for him? How did they know? Andrew's expression was apologetic as they maneuvered Jack into the cabin. My father visited the bank yesterday, demanded to see the records of all transactions when he saw the withdrawal from Daniel's insurance policy. He knew someone had come for it on my behalf, Rebecca finished, guiding Jack to a chair. He set a trap. Jack made a sound that might have been a laugh if not for the pain evident in his face. Not a very good one. They only managed this before I convinced them to reconsider. He nodded toward his side, where blood had seeped through his coat. Knife wound, Andrew explained, his voice tight with what seemed like genuine concern. Not deep, from what I could tell, but he's lost blood. I found him on the road about 2 miles back, recognized the horse from my brother's descriptions. Rebecca was already gathering clean cloths, water, and the small medical kit Jack kept in a wooden box by the fire. "Emma," she called, "bring me the whiskey from the top shelf." Her hands moved with purpose, steadier than she felt inside. As she helped Jack remove his coat and blood-stained shirt, Rebecca's mind raced with questions and fears. The wound was indeed not life-threatening. A slash across his ribs that had bled freely but didn't appear to have damaged anything vital. Still, the sight of Jack's blood, of the pain in his eyes when she cleaned the wound, made her hands tremble slightly. "Lucky," Jack murmured as she worked. "Could have been worse." "Lucky would have been avoiding my father's men entirely," Andrew said, standing awkwardly by the door. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thornton. I should have anticipated this." Jack shook his head slightly. "Not your fault." Emma appeared from the bedroom, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Jack shirtless and bloodied, her mother working intently, a stranger standing by the door. Instead of showing fear, she straightened her small shoulders and brought the whiskey bottle directly to Rebecca. "Is Mr. Jack going to be all right?" she asked, her voice small but steady. Rebecca managed a reassuring smile. "Yes, sweetheart. The cut isn't too deep. Mr. Jack is very strong." Emma nodded solemnly, then turned to Andrew with a directness that momentarily startled the banker. "Are you my uncle? You look like my papa in the pictures." Andrew Miller seemed taken aback by the question, his composure slipping to reveal genuine emotion. Yes, I suppose I am. I'm your father's brother, Andrew." "I'm Emma." She studied him with unnerving intensity. "Did you help Mr. Jack because you're sorry about what grandfather did to us?" The bluntness of the child's question hung in the air. Andrew Miller, dressed in his fine wool coat with its polished buttons, looked suddenly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of his niece. "Yes," he said finally. "I am sorry, Emma. Your grandfather, he doesn't always do what's right. I tried to convince him, but..." He stopped, apparently realizing he was attempting to explain complex adult failures to a child. "Yes, I helped, Mr. Thornton, because what happened to you and your mother wasn't right." Emma considered this, then nodded as if satisfied. "Thank you for bringing Mr. Jack home." The word home lingered in the cabin air, weaving itself around the 4 of them like an invisible thread. Rebecca felt it settle in her chest as she finished bandaging Jack's wound. This place had indeed become home in a way the cottage on Silverwood Ranch never truly had. Jack grimaced as he sat up straighter, accepting the small measure of whiskey Rebecca offered for the pain. "The money," he said to Andrew. "Is it safe?" Andrew patted the saddlebag he'd set by the door. "All of it. $500. As the policy promised, I brought it myself rather than risk another messenger." Rebecca nearly dropped the bandages she was gathering. $500. It was a small fortune, enough to start fresh anywhere, to provide for Emma's education, to secure their future in ways she had barely dared hope for. Daniel was always careful with money, Andrew said, a hint of pride in his voice. Saved. From every cattle sale, every harvest, kept it quiet from our father, who would have claimed he needed to reinvest it in the ranch. He hesitated, then added, "There's something else. A letter Daniel wrote to be delivered to you in the event of his death. The insurance company held it along with the policy." From his coat, Andrew withdrew an envelope, somewhat creased from travel but sealed with wax. Rebecca accepted it with trembling fingers, recognizing Daniel's handwriting immediately. "I'll leave you to read it privately," Andrew said, moving toward the door. "I should head back before nightfall. If my father discovers I've been up here..." Jack started to rise, wincing with the effort. "The money stays here," Andrew said firmly. "It belongs to Rebecca and Emma. My father has no legal claim to it, though he'll certainly try to find a way." He met Rebecca's gaze directly. I can't openly oppose him. The ranch is my livelihood too, and he'd cut me off without hesitation. But I can do this much for Daniel's family." Rebecca was momentarily speechless, overcome by this unexpected ally from the very family that had cast her out. "Thank you, Andrew. Truly." Andrew shifted uncomfortably under her gratitude. "Daniel was my brother. I should have done more, sooner." He glanced at Jack. "Rest, Mr. Thornton. That wound needs time to heal." His gaze returned to Rebecca. "When you decide what you want to do next, where you want to go, send word through Sheriff Cooper. I'll help if I can." After Andrew departed, refusing offers of food or rest before his journey back to the valley, Rebecca found herself standing. In the center of the cabin, Daniel's letter in one hand, the saddlebag containing their future in the other. Emma had gone to sit beside Jack, chattering softly to him about the wooden rabbit he'd made her, seemingly untroubled by the day's events now that he was safely home. Home. The word echoed in Rebecca's mind again as she watched them together. Her golden-haired daughter and this solitary mountain man who had risked his life to secure their future. Jack listened intently to Emma's chatter, his eyes warm despite the pain he must still be feeling, one large hand gently correcting her grip as she showed him her progress on her own whittling project. In that moment, Rebecca understood with perfect clarity that the question was no longer where she and Emma would go when spring arrived. The question was whether Jack Thornton would ask them to stay. After Emma had finally fallen asleep, Rebecca sat alone by the hearth, Daniel's letter in her hands. The wax seal bore the imprint of his signet ring, a simple M surrounded by wheat sheaves, a wedding gift from his mother that he'd rarely worn. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper within, his familiar handwriting bringing a fresh wave of grief. "My dearest Rebecca, if you are reading this, then I have left you and our precious Emma far too soon. I pray it isn't so, that this letter remains sealed for decades until we are both gray and surrounded by grandchildren. But life on the frontier has taught me to prepare for harsh possibilities. I have arranged this insurance policy without my father's knowledge. $500 seems a paltry sum to leave the two people I cherish most. But it is something. Use it to build whatever life brings you happiness, whether that means staying in Pine Creek Valley or journeying elsewhere. I must confess something that has weighed on me. You know my father is stern and my mother is cold, but perhaps you've wondered why they treated you with such particular disdain from the beginning. The truth is painful, but you deserve to know it now, that I cannot shield you from its consequences. Before I met you, I was briefly engaged to Harriet Walsh, daughter of my father's closest business associate. The arrangement was made without my consent during my schooling back east. When I returned and discovered the plans, I refused. It caused a rift with my father that never fully healed. When I then chose you, a woman of education rather than fortune, of character rather than connections, he saw it as deliberate defiance. My mother cannot forgive that the Walsh alliance would have doubled the ranch holdings. My father cannot forgive being denied his will. Neither of them could see what I saw immediately in your letters, a mind and heart that would challenge and complete mine. I tell you this not to burden you, but to free you from wondering if you somehow failed to earn their acceptance. You did not fail, my love. They did. One final confidence. My brother Andrew may seem to stand with our parents, but his heart is kinder than he shows. If you need an ally after I am gone, approach him privately. He admired your defense of the Mexican ranch hand's children when mother refused to let them attend your lessons. Small moments reveal true character. Rebecca, if happiness finds you again in the form of new love, embrace it without guilt. You were made to share your gentle strength, not to live in isolation. Emma needs more than memories of her father. She needs the present love of family, whatever form that may take. I leave you both with my eternal love and the knowledge that knowing you has been the great privilege of my life. Forever yours. Daniel. Rebecca pressed the letter to her heart, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Daniel's words released something tightly wound within her. A permission she hadn't realized she'd been waiting for, a final conversation they'd never had the chance to share. The revelation about his parents explained so much, lifting a weight of inadequacy she'd carried since first meeting Martha Miller's disapproving gaze. Her eyes drifted to Jack, who slept fitfully on his bedroll near the fire, his injured side preventing his usual rest. In the flickering light, his face appeared softer, the hard lines of survival smoothed by sleep. She studied him openly in a way she never would have dared while he was awake. The strong line of his jaw beneath his beard, the small scar near his left eyebrow, the powerful hands now relaxed in repose. This man had risked everything for her and Emma, asking nothing in return. And despite her best efforts to remain practical, to view their arrangement as temporary necessity, Rebecca could no longer deny the truth that had been growing within. Her heart, like early spring wildflowers, pushing through mountain snow. She folded Daniel's letter carefully and tucked it into her dress pocket. Tomorrow, she would speak with Jack about their future. But tonight, she allowed herself to simply watch over him as he had watched over them, a silent guardian in the quiet hours. The March wind howled around the cabin's sturdy logs as dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold. Jack woke to find Rebecca already up, stoking the fire with practiced efficiency. The pain in his side had dulled to a persistent ache, uncomfortable but manageable. He sat up slowly, testing his limits. "You should rest another day," Rebecca said without turning, somehow sensing his movement. "That wound won't heal if you keep testing it." Jack grunted non-committally, reaching for his shirt. "Need to check the snare line? Storm's coming." Rebecca turned then, a familiar determination in her expression. "Emma can check the nearest snares. I taught her the safe route yesterday while you slept, and I can handle the rest." "You shouldn't go that far alone," Jack protested, though he knew she'd grown capable during their weeks together. Rebecca approached, gently pressing him back down with a hand on his shoulder. The casual touch would have been unthinkable weeks ago, but their boundaries had gradually softened like snow under spring sun. "You've done enough, Jack. Let us care for you now." The simple statement disarmed him more effectively than any argument could have. Jack subsided, watching as Rebecca poured him coffee and placed a plate of pan bread beside him. "Read Daniel's letter last night," she said quietly, sitting across from him. Jack nodded, waiting. He wouldn't press for details she might wish to keep private. He explained why his parents were so cold from the beginning, an arranged marriage I knew nothing about, a business alliance I apparently ruined. She shook her head slightly. All this time, I thought it was something lacking in me. Nothing lacking in you, Jack said firmly, the words escaping before he could consider them. A soft flush colored Rebecca's cheeks. Daniel also said something else, that if happiness found me again, I should embrace it without guilt. Her eyes met his directly, that Emma needs more than memories. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs, harder than when he'd faced the Miller men on the mountain road. Rebecca, let me finish, she said gently. These past weeks have taught me more than how to set snares and chop wood. They've shown me that strength comes in many forms, that a quiet life can be a full one, that Emma and I could be happy here. Jack sat perfectly still, afraid to break whatever spell allowed Rebecca Miller to speak such words. Are you asking to stay past spring? I'm asking if you want us to stay, she countered. This is your home, your sanctuary. We arrived uninvited, disrupted everything. Not everything, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. Some things you've restored. Before Rebecca could respond, Emma burst from the bedroom, her hair wild from sleep, clutching her wooden rabbit. Is Mr. Jack better today? Can we finish my carving lesson? The adult conversation suspended itself, wrapped carefully and set aside like precious cargo to be retrieved when privacy returned. Rebecca smiled at her daughter. Mr. Jack needs to rest today, but perhaps you can show him how well you checked the snares yesterday. Emma bounced with excitement. I found 2 rabbits, and I remembered everything. Checking for tracks around them first, approaching from downwind, being gentle with the animals even though they're already dead. Jack felt a surge of pride that surprised him with its intensity. Good work, little one. That's more than most grown men remember their first time. The day passed in quiet domesticity, Emma checking the nearby snares under Rebecca's watchful eye, Jack reluctantly resting but contributing by teaching Emma to clean her catch, Rebecca preserving the extra meat for later use. By evening, the promised storm had arrived, battering the cabin with wind and sleet. Good night to be indoors, Jack observed as they finished their rabbit stew. Storm like this can last days this time of year. Will the animals be all right? Emma asked, concern furrowing her brow. Jack smiled at her compassion. They know what to do, little one. They've weathered more storms than any of us. After Emma was tucked into bed with a story, Rebecca returned to the main room to find Jack standing at the window, staring into the darkness where wind-driven sleet created ghostly patterns in the lantern light. Earlier, she said quietly, picking up their interrupted conversation with characteristic directness, you said I'd restored some things. What did you mean? Jack continued, looking outward, gathering his thoughts. Words had never been his strong suit. He'd spent too many years with only trees and mountains for company, but Rebecca deserved his best effort. Before you came, he began slowly, this place was just shelter. Kept rain off my head, cold from my bones. Did what needed doing each day. Hunted, trapped, traded, slept. Didn't think beyond that. He turned to face her. First night you and Emma stayed, she asked me to read to her. Couldn't sleep, she said. Too strange a place. So I read from that old copy of Swiss Family Robinson. Hadn't touched that book in years. Hadn't read aloud since your sister, Rebecca finished gently. Jack nodded. Halfway through the chapter, looked over and found she'd fallen asleep. But you were listening, sitting by the door. Remember what you said? Rebecca smiled. You have a good reading voice. You shouldn't waste it on empty rooms. That's when I knew, Jack admitted. This place had been empty, not just of people, of purpose beyond survival. He gestured toward the bedroom where Emma slept. She brings life wherever she goes. And you... He stopped, the words catching like burrs in his throat. Rebecca moved. Closer, close enough that he could see the firelight reflected in her eyes. And "You make me remember what it's like to be seen," Jack said finally. "Not as the mountain man, not as the killer who fled town, just as a man." Rebecca reached out, her fingers lightly touching his hand where it rested on the windowsill. "Is that enough reason for us to stay? Being witnesses to each other's lives?" Jack turned his hand, capturing her fingers in his. "For me, yes. But you should want more. Emma should have more. School, friends, opportunities I can't give her here. Perhaps we don't have to choose," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "Andrew mentioned that the old Summers place at the edge of Riverdale has been vacant since the family moved to Oregon last fall. With Daniel's insurance money, I could purchase it. Emma could attend school in town, and I'm not welcome." "In Riverdale," Jack reminded her, though without bitterness. "Times change. Sheriff Cooper said as much." Rebecca's fingers tightened around his. "You could stay here, continue as you have, but perhaps you might visit sometimes. Perhaps the distance between your world and ours needn't be so absolute." Jack considered her words, weighing possibilities that had seemed unthinkable months ago. "And what would people say about a widow receiving visits from a man like me?" "They will talk regardless," Rebecca said with unexpected steel in her voice. "They talked when I taught ranch children to read. They talked when I wore trousers to help Daniel with the spring carving. Let them talk." Her expression softened. "Unless you prefer, we simply remain here." The choice hung between them, a future, balanced on the edge of transformation. Jack struggled to articulate the tumult of emotions her suggestion had unleashed. Before he could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Both froze, exchanging alarmed glances. No one should be on the mountain in this weather. At this hour, Jack reached for his rifle, gesturing for Rebecca to move away from the door. She complied, but retrieved the smaller shotgun from its place on the wall, checking that it was loaded with steady hands that betrayed her growing frontier competence. "Who's there?" Jack called, positioning himself to the side of the door. Out of the direct line of fire should trouble burst through. "Andrew Miller," came the strained reply, "and Dr. Hayes. We need help." Jack opened the door cautiously, rifle ready, to find Andrew supporting a half-conscious Benjamin Hayes on the cabin's porch. Both men were drenched, exhausted, and clearly in distress. "What happened?" Jack demanded, helping to bring the doctor inside while Rebecca quickly cleared space near the fire. "Ambush," Andrew gasped, his city clothes soaked through, his face pale with cold and exertion. "Coming back from delivering a baby at the Peterson farm, someone shot at us from the trees." Dr. Hayes groaned as they lowered him to the pallet Rebecca had prepared. Blood stained his coat sleeve and sighed. "Bullet just grazed my arm," the doctor managed, "but I took a bad fall from the wagon when the horses bolted. Think I've broken some ribs." Rebecca was already gathering bandages and the medical supplies they'd used for Jack's injury. "Emma," she called, "I need hot water quickly." The girl appeared in the bedroom doorway, taking in the scene with wide eyes before rushing to obey her mother without question. "Why come here?" Jack asked Andrew, as they removed the doctor's wet coat. "Town's closer than my cabin from the Peterson place." Andrew's expression darkened. "Because it was my father's men who fired on us, and we couldn't risk bringing the doctor to town where they'd find him." Jack and Rebecca exchanged shocked glances. "Why would George Miller want to harm the doctor?" Rebecca asked, helping Emma with the kettle of heated water. "Because I confronted him," Andrew said grimly. "After I returned from bringing Jack home, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Told him I knew he'd sent men to ambush you on the road, that I'd helped you reach safety, that his treatment of Daniel's widow was shameful." Dr. Hayes winced as Rebecca began cleaning his wounds. "And I backed Andrew publicly at the town meeting last night, said what the Millers did to Mrs. Miller and the child was unconscionable." that the whole town was complicit in their cruelty by remaining silent. "Town meeting?" Rebecca asked, surprised. Andrew nodded. "Called to discuss the spring cattle drive and railroad shipments, but it turned into something else when Hayes spoke up. Several others joined in. Maggie Wilson, Pastor Thomas, even Sheriff Cooper said they'd let fear of my father's influence keep them silent too long." "Oh, George was furious," the doctor continued weakly. "Threatened to ruin anyone who stood with Daniel's widow. Said he'd see the cattle contracts given to ranches across the territorial line before he'd let the town dictate how he handled family matters." "I never expected him to resort to violence," Andrew said, self-recrimination evident in his voice. "Not against the town doctor of all people." Jack's expression had hardened as he listened. "This isn't about Rebecca and Emma anymore. Your father's afraid of losing control. Makes him dangerous." "More dangerous than you know," Andrew agreed. "He's filed a legal petition claiming Emma should be in his custody as her closest male relative. Says Rebecca has demonstrated moral failings by living unchaperoned with," he glanced apologetically at Jack, "with a known killer." Rebecca's hands stilled in their work. "He's trying to take my daughter." Her voice was quiet, but filled with a mother's terrible fury. "Judge Parker arrives from Helena next week for the spring circuit court," Dr. Hayes explained. "George plans to present his petition then. Parker and my father are old friends," Andrew added grimly. "Unless something changes dramatically, he'll likely rule in my father's favor." Rebecca finished bandaging the doctor's arm. Her movements precise, despite the trembling Jack could see, she fought to control. "He will not take my child," she said with quiet certainty. "I would flee the territory first." "Which is exactly what he expects," Andrew said. "He has men watching the stage. Depot and the trails out of the valley. If you run, he'll use it as proof you're an unfit mother." The cabin fell silent, except for the howling wind and crackling fire. Emma had returned to the bedroom doorway, her small face solemn as she listened to the adults discussing her fate. Jack saw the moment Rebecca noticed her daughter's presence, watched her school her features into reassuring calm. "Emma, would you bring Dr. Hayes some water, please?" Rebecca asked gently. "And perhaps one of those spice cookies we baked yesterday." So, when Emma had moved away on her errand, Rebecca turned back to the men, her voice low but intense. "What can we do? There must be a way to fight this." Dr. Hayes shifted painfully. "Respectability is what matters to Judge Parker. If Rebecca were married, living in a proper home, George's petition would hold less weight." "I have the insurance money," Rebecca said thoughtfully. "Enough to buy a home in town, as I mentioned earlier. But marriage—" She stopped, glancing at Jack. Andrew followed her gaze, understanding dawning in his expression. "It would have to be before the judge arrives, and you'd need to be established in town, not living up here." Jack remained silent, his thoughts churning. Marriage. The word felt foreign in his mind, a concept from another life. He had long ago reconciled himself to solitude, had built his existence around the certainty of it. Yet the thought of Rebecca and Emma remaining in his life, becoming his family in truth rather than temporary circumstance, it stirred something he'd thought permanently dormant. But town, Riverdale, the place that had driven him into exile, could he truly return? Could he subject Rebecca to the whispers, the sideways glances, the inevitable judgment that would follow her as the woman who married the mountain recluse? "Jack!" Rebecca's voice broke through his thoughts. "You've gone very quiet." He looked up to find all eyes on him. Andrew's speculative, the doctor's assessing, and Rebecca's. Her gaze held a question he wasn't sure he was worthy to answer. "Need to think," he said gruffly, rising and moving toward the door. "Need to check the horses. Make sure they're sheltered from the storm." Outside in the howling sleet, Jack leaned against the cabin wall, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Marriage, family, town. The concepts swirled around him like the storm itself, disorienting in their intensity. Rebecca deserved better than a scarred mountain man with blood on his hands. Emma deserved a father figure who could move freely in society, who wouldn't bring whispers and judgment down upon her innocent head. Yet the alternative, George Miller taking Emma, Rebecca devastated, both lost to him forever, was unthinkable. In the stable, he checked the horses mechanically, ensuring they had feed and water, that Andrew's mount and the doctors recovered. Their horse were properly tended. The routine tasks centered him, allowed his mind to work through the tangle of possibilities. When he returned to the cabin, he found Rebecca alone by the fire. Andrew and Hayes had been settled in the main room for the night, both exhausted from their ordeal and now sleeping deeply. Emma, too, had returned to bed. "They'll need to rest at least a day before attempting the trip back to town," Rebecca said, quietly, as Jack hung his coat by the door. "The doctor's injuries aren't life-threatening, but he's in considerable pain." Jack nodded, moving to sit across from her. "Rebecca, about what they suggested." "It doesn't have to be real," she interrupted, her eyes fixed on the flames. "A marriage on paper to protect Emma. I would never expect," she faltered, then continued, "your life here is your own. I wouldn't ask you to change it." Jack studied her profile, the proud angle of her chin, the vulnerability she tried to hide. "Is that what you want? A marriage in name only?" Rebecca finally met his gaze, and in her eyes he saw conflict that matched his own. "What I want," she said carefully, "is my daughter's safety. What I want is not to be forced to choose between her future and—" She stopped, color rising in her cheeks. "And," Jack prompted gently. "And whatever this is between us," she finished, her voice barely audible. "This trust, this understanding, this possibility." The word possibility hung in the air between them, fragile and radiant as the first spring crocus. Jack reached across the space separating them, his calloused hand covering hers where it rested on her knee. "If we do this, it won't be just on paper. Not for me." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff, exhilarating and terrifying at once. "But you should know what you'd be taking on. The town hasn't forgotten, some never will." "I don't need the town's approval," Rebecca said, turning her hand to clasp his. "I've lived without it since the day I arrived." Emma adores you, Rebecca finished, "and children are more resilient than we give them credit for. She's already faced cruelty from those who should have loved her unconditionally. Better, she have one person who truly cares for her than a respectable life, with people who see her as nothing but a Miller heir." Jack took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "If we do this, we do it right. Not rushed, not desperate. Need to speak to Cooper first. Make sure my returning to town won't end with me in chains. Need to find out exactly what happened to the man who attacked me at Wade's orders all those years ago." Rebecca's fingers tightened around his. "You think he might still want revenge? Need to know before I bring that danger to your doorstep," Jack said firmly. "And we need a home in town ready before Judge Parker arrives. Somewhere Emma can have her own room, with space for a garden, perhaps." A smile bloomed slowly across Rebecca's face. "You've given this thought since the moment you suggested purchasing the Summers place," Jack admitted. "Couldn't help myself." "Then you're considering it, truly." Hope illuminated her features in a way that made Jack's chest ache. "More than considering," he said, quietly. "If you'll have me, a man who spent 9 years speaking more to trees than people, who can't offer you society or fine things, then yes, I'll marry you, Rebecca Miller. Not just on paper, not just for Emma, for us." The weight of the declaration seemed to fill the cabin, pressing against the walls that had witnessed their gradual journey from strangers to something much more profound. Rebecca's eyes glistened in the firelight, and when she spoke, her voice held the strength he'd come to admire and the tenderness he'd barely dared hope for. "Jack Thornton," she said, I believed my heart had room for only one great love in this lifetime. I was wrong. She moved from her chair to kneel beside him, her hand still clasped in his. This isn't how I imagined beginning again. It isn't the path I would have chosen, but it's a path I would walk gladly with you beside me. The storm outside redoubled its fury, sleet giving way to heavy snow that blanketed the mountain in pristine white. Inside, Jack drew Rebecca gently to him, his free hand cupping her cheek with a reverence that belied his rough exterior. When their lips met, it was neither desperate nor tentative. It was the sealing of an understanding that had been building since that first night he'd appeared on her porch with firewood and venison, and the simple human kindness she'd been denied. A discreet cough from across the room reminded them they weren't alone. Dr. Hayes had awakened and was watching them with a mixture of embarrassment and amusement. "Well," he said dryly, "it appears my prescription of marriage may not be as medicinal as I thought." Rebecca laughed softly, pressing her forehead briefly against Jack's shoulder before moving back to her chair with quiet dignity. "Your professional opinion is still appreciated, Doctor." Hayes nodded, wincing slightly at the movement. "My professional opinion is that you two should make haste to town as soon as this storm clears. I'll testify to Judge Parker about George Miller's men firing on an unarmed physician if needed. Combined with a proper marriage and household, it should counter his petition effectively." "What about your safety?" Jack asked, his mind already calculating new risks and responsibilities. "Miller won't take kindly to your testimony." "I've delivered half the babies in this valley, including George Miller's grandchildren," Hayes replied with grim satisfaction. "Let him try to turn the town against me. Besides, I'm not the only one who'll speak up now. Something changed at that town meeting. People remembered they have voices." Andrew stirred from his place near the wall, apparently having also awakened during their conversation. "My father has ruled through fear for too long," he said, sitting up carefully. "Even I have been complicit out of cowardice, but no more." Jack studied Daniel's brother, seeing genuine resolve in his face. "Could be dangerous, standing against him so openly." "Daniel would have done the same for my family," Andrew said simply. "I owe him this much." As the night deepened around the cabin, plans began to take shape. Practical, necessary steps toward a future none of them could have imagined weeks before. Rebecca would use Daniel's insurance money to purchase the Summers place immediately. Jack would accompany Sheriff Cooper into town under his protection to establish that no outstanding warrants remained from the incident 9 years past. They would marry before Judge Parker arrived, presenting a united front against George Miller's petition. Yet beneath these practical considerations flowed a current of something far less pragmatic. Jack found his eyes returning again and again to Rebecca as she spoke, to the graceful movement of her hands, the determined set of her jaw, the occasional shy glance she cast in his direction when she thought others weren't watching. Each look confirmed what he already knew. This marriage of necessity had deeper foundations than mere convenience. Later, with Andrew and Hayes finally asleep again, and Rebecca checking on Emma, Jack stood at the window, watching the storm gradually subside. Stars appeared in breaks between clouds, brilliant and sharp in the mountain air. The future stretching before him was as vast and unknown as the sky itself, filled with possibilities both bright and daunting. "She's still sleeping," Rebecca said softly, appearing at his side. "Storms never seem to trouble her rest." "She trusts she's safe," Jack replied. "Children know more than we think." Rebecca nodded, her shoulder just touching his arm as they watched the night together. "When should we tell her about our plans?" Jack considered the question carefully. "Tomorrow. Together. She should understand this isn't just for her protection, that it's a choice we're making because we care for each other." "And do you," Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible, "care for me?" Jack turned to her, abandoning his customary reserve. "More than I have words to express. More than I thought possible after so many years alone." Rebecca's smile in response held such radiance that Jack felt something final shift within him. The last remnant of the solitary man he had been, making room for the man he was becoming. She leaned against him, her head coming to rest naturally against his shoulder, and together they watched as the storm clouds parted completely, revealing the vast canvas of stars above the mountains they both called home. Morning found the world, transformed. Snow gleaming pristine and untouched across the clearing, trees encased in crystal sheaths that scattered light like thousands of prisms. Emma was the first to discover the magnificence, her delighted exclamations drawing the adults to the windows to witness nature's artistry. "It's like a fairy kingdom," she breathed, pressing her nose to the glass. "Can I go outside, Mama? Please?" Rebecca exchanged glances with Jack, who nodded. "Just for a little while," she agreed. "Bundle up warmly." As Emma darted to collect her coat and mittens, Jack moved closer to Rebecca. "Ready to tell her?" Rebecca nodded, though uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "I hope she understands. It's happening so quickly." "Children understand more than we give them credit for," Jack reminded her, "especially one as perceptive as Emma." They followed Emma outside, watching as she twirled in the fresh snow, face tilted toward the brilliant blue sky. After allowing her a few minutes of uninhibited joy, Rebecca called her over to where she and Jack stood by the cabin steps. "Emma, sweetheart, we need to talk to you about something important," Rebecca began, kneeling to her daughter's level despite the snow. Emma looked between them, sudden worry creasing her small brow. "Are we leaving? Do we have to go back to Grandfather's ranch?" "No," Jack said firmly, crouching beside Rebecca. "You're not going back there. Ever." Relief washed over Emma's face, but confusion quickly followed. "Then what is it?" Rebecca took her daughter's mittened hands. "Mr. Jack and I have been talking about the future, about what's best for all of us. We care about each other," Jack added, his gruff voice gentling as it always did when he addressed Emma. "Your mother and I, and we both care about you." Emma nodded solemnly. "I know that. Your family now." The simple declaration, delivered with a child's straightforward certainty, momentarily robbed both adults of speech. Jack recovered first, his weathered face softening with emotion he no longer tried to conceal. "That's right, little one. We are family, and we'd like to make that official." He glanced at Rebecca, who continued, "Jack has asked me to marry him, Emma. That would make him your stepfather." Rebecca watched her daughter carefully. "We wanted to know how you feel about that." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful as she processed this new information. "Would we live here? In the cabin?" "For now," Jack answered. "But soon we'd move to town, to a house there. So you could go to school, make friends." "And you'd come too?" Emma asked, fixing him with a direct gaze that reminded Jack powerfully of her mother. "I would," he confirmed. "It won't be easy at first. Some folks in town might not be welcoming to me, or to us as a family, but we'd face that together." Emma considered this, her small face serious. Then she turned to her mother. "Would you be happy with Mr. Jack as your husband?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears at her daughter's concern. "Yes, Emma, I believe I would be very happy." Emma nodded decisively. "Then it's a good plan." She looked up at Jack. "Will I call you Papa?" The question pierced Jack to his core. He swallowed hard before answering. "You can call me whatever feels right to you, little one. Jack is fine. Papa someday, perhaps, if you want to. There's no hurry to decide." Emma stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist, her small body warm against him despite the cold morning air. "I'm glad you found us in the snow that night," she said, her voice muffled against his coat. Jack's arms came around her, one hand gently cradling the back of her head. So am I, Emma. So am I. Over the child's golden head, his eyes met Rebecca's, finding in them a mirror of his own emotion. Gratitude for what they had found amid loss, hope for what they were building together, and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not alone, but as a family forged, through choice rather than circumstance. Morning frost still clung to the grass when Judge Parker's wagon rattled into Riverdale. The town, barely stirring in the early dawn, paid little notice to his arrival. A mercy Jack appreciated as he watched from the shadow of the mercantile. The judge's early appearance meant the petition hearing would proceed as scheduled, another step toward resolving the Miller family's claim on Emma. Jack's hand unconsciously moved to his side where the knife wound had nearly healed, a persistent reminder of George Miller's determination to maintain control at any cost. Sheriff Cooper emerged from his office, nodding briefly to Jack before approaching the judge's wagon. Their conversation was brief, heads bent together against the morning chill, but Cooper's expression as he walked toward Jack suggested positive developments. Judge Parker reviewed the statements from Dr. Hayes and Lily Baker last night, Cooper said, his voice low despite the empty street. Seems particularly interested in hearing Emma's perspective directly. Says children's wishes are often overlooked in custody matters. Jack absorbed this information with his characteristic economy of expression. Good sign. Cooper adjusted his hat. Better than expected. Parker has a reputation for fairness, even when powerful interests are involved. Having Senator Baker's wife testify about your character certainly doesn't hurt. The sheriff glanced toward the hotel where George Miller and his lawyer had taken rooms. Miller's been making rounds, though, spent yesterday afternoon with several merchants who owe him money, reminding them where their interests lie, I expect. Townfolk can think what they want, Jack replied. Judge is what matters. Cooper's expression was skeptical. In legal terms, yes, but you and Rebecca are planning to make a life here. Public opinion matters more than you might like to admit. Jack had no response to this uncomfortable truth. His years of solitude had insulated him from caring about others' perceptions, but Emma and Rebecca deserved better than suspicious glances and whispered judgments. They had already endured enough at the Millers' hands. Rebecca still planning to have Emma at the hearing? Cooper asked. Jack nodded. Says the girl deserves to witness decisions about her future. Hard to disagree. Brave woman you've married, Cooper observed. Braver child she's raised. Jack couldn't suppress a flicker of pride at these words. Both stronger than they know. Their conversation ended as more townspeople began appearing on the street, their curious glances a reminder of the spectacle the hearing promised to become. Jack returned to the house he now shared with Rebecca and Emma, finding breakfast underway and preparations for the day in full motion. Emma sat at the table, her hair freshly braided and secured with blue ribbons that matched her dress, the finest outfit she owned, saved from her father's funeral and carefully altered by Rebecca over the past few nights. The sight of her solemn preparation tightened something in Jack's chest. Nervous, little one? He asked, accepting the coffee Rebecca handed him. Emma considered the question with her characteristic thoughtfulness. A little. Grandfather can be very loud when displeased. She looked up at Jack with earnest eyes. But you'll be there too, and Mama says the judge is a fair man who listens carefully. That he is, Jack confirmed, marveling at this child's composure. 9 years in the mountains hadn't prepared him for the complexities of parenthood, yet somehow this small girl had accepted him into her life with a trust he still felt unworthy of. Rebecca moved efficiently around the kitchen, her actions betraying none of the anxiety Jack knew she must feel. They had discussed the possibilities late into the night, that Parker might rule in George's favor, that Emma might be removed from their care, that their hasty marriage might be viewed as the legal maneuver George claimed it to be, rather than the genuine partnership it had become. Judge arrived early, Jack informed her quietly when Emma went upstairs to fetch her coat. Cooper thinks he's inclined to consider Emma's wishes. Relief softened the tension around Rebecca's eyes momentarily. That's something, at least. I've tried to prepare her for questions without influencing her answers. No need, Jack assured her. Emma knows her own mind. Always has. This earned him a genuine smile, the first of the day. A trait I suspect my father-in-law finds particularly vexing in females of any age. Jack's response was interrupted by a knock at the door. Andrew Miller stood on their porch, his customary elegant attire replaced by simpler clothing that suggested he was distancing himself from his father's ostentatious display of wealth. "I've just come from the courthouse," he said without preamble. "Father has brought reinforcements. 3 business associates from Helena who claim to have known Daniel well. They'll testify about his supposed intentions for Emma's upbringing." Rebecca's expression tightened. Daniel rarely spoke to his father's associates. They know nothing of his wishes. "Unfortunately, Parker won't know that," Andrew replied grimly. "It will be their word against yours." "Not just Rebecca's," Jack interjected. "Daniel wrote his intentions clearly enough in the letter that came with the insurance policy." Andrew nodded. "Which is why I've arranged for Josiah Bennett from the bank to authenticate Daniel's handwriting. He processed enough of my brother's cattle sale transactions to confirm it without question." This thoughtful preparation eased some of Jack's concern. Andrew Miller had proven himself a more principled man than Jack initially believed, risking his father's considerable wrath to support Daniel's widow and child. "Any word from your mother?" Rebecca asked, the question clearly difficult for her to voice. Andrew's expression softened slightly. "She's attending the hearing. Beyond that," he shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its resignation. "Mother has spent 30 years deferring to father's judgment. I don't expect that to change today." Their conversation halted as Emma descended the stairs, coat buttoned neatly and a small book clutched in her hands, Daniel's Bible, Jack recognized, which she had taken to carrying since their arrival in town. "Uncle Andrew," she greeted with genuine warmth, "are you coming to court with us?" Andrew knelt to her level, his formal demeanor melting away. "Indeed I am, Miss Emma, and perhaps afterward, if the day goes well, we might visit Wilson's Mercantile. I hear Maggie received a shipment of peppermint sticks yesterday." Emma's eyes brightened at this prospect, a moment of childhood delight breaking through the solemnity of the day. Jack exchanged glances with Rebecca, both grateful for Andrew's attempt to normalize this experience for Emma. The courthouse had drawn a crowd that spilled onto the street, forcing Sheriff Cooper to establish order as they approached. Jack positioned himself slightly ahead of Rebecca and Emma, a physical barrier against the stares and whispers that followed them. Dr. Hayes waited near the entrance with Lily Baker and her husband, their presence a visible testament to the support Jack hadn't dared hope for when they'd first entered town. Inside, the room had been arranged with formal precision. Benches filled with spectators, a table for each party in the dispute, and Judge Parker's elevated desk commanding the space. George and Martha Miller already occupied their positions, accompanied by their lawyer and the business associates Andrew had mentioned. George's expression remained impassive, but Jack noted the rigid set of his shoulders, the barely concealed fury in his eyes as they entered. Judge Parker called the proceedings to order with efficient authority, establishing rules of conduct before addressing the purpose of the hearing directly. This court will consider the petition of George and Martha Miller for guardianship of their granddaughter, Emma Miller, currently in the custody of her mother, Rebecca Thornton, and stepfather, Jack Thornton. Parker surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on Emma. As this matter concerns a child's welfare, I expect all parties to maintain decorum regardless of personal feelings. George Miller's lawyer, Harrington, presented their case first, his polished, arguments emphasizing the miller's wealth, social position, and blood relation to Emma. He characterized Rebecca as a grieving widow who had made irrational decisions, culminating in a hasty marriage to a man with a documented history of violence. The Millers can provide advantages Mrs. Thornton simply cannot, Harrington asserted. Education at the finest schools, social connections that will secure Emma's future, and the legacy her father built as a respected rancher. Jack watched Rebecca's face as these arguments unfolded, admiring her composure. Only the slight whitening of her knuckles as she clasped her hands revealed her distress. When Rebecca's turn came, she spoke without notes, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, my late husband valued education and character above wealth and social position. He married a schoolteacher with no fortune or connections because he shared those values." She paused, her gaze moving briefly to Martha Miller. "Daniel arranged the insurance policy specifically to ensure Emma and I would have independence. He anticipated his parents might not support our choices." She proceeded to detail the circumstances of their eviction from the cottage, Jack's intervention during the blizzard, and the growing bond between Emma and her new stepfather. "Our marriage was not a legal strategy, but the natural outcome of mutual respect that grew during our time together. Jack Thornton has shown Emma nothing but patience, kindness, and protection, the qualities that truly matter in a parent." Judge Parker's questions were incisive but fair, probing Rebecca's plans for Emma's education and future. Rebecca responded with the clear-eyed practicality that had first impressed Jack during their weeks in the cabin, outlining her intention to resume teaching and the provisions they'd made for Emma's schooling. When Jack was called to testify, he forced himself to overcome his natural reticence, understanding that his words could determine Emma's future. He spoke plainly about his past, the circumstances of the confrontation with Harlan Wade's men, and his reasons for helping Rebecca and Emma that winter night. "Had no intention of marriage or family when I found them," he admitted. "Just couldn't leave a woman and child to freeze. The rest..." He glanced at Rebecca, finding strength in her steady gaze. "The rest happened because it was meant to." Lily Baker's testimony proved particularly compelling, her elegant appearance and connection to Senator Baker lending weight to her account of Jack's intervention years earlier. "Jack Thornton risked everything to help me escape a forced marriage," she stated clearly. "He acted with honor when most men would have looked away. That same character is evident in how he's protected Rebecca and Emma Miller." Dr. Hayes followed with clinical precision, describing the ambush that had left Jack wounded and his own attack when returning from a medical call. "I've treated injuries resulting from violence for 30 years, he concluded. "I recognize the difference between a man defending others and one seeking violence. Jack Thornton is firmly the former." Throughout these testimonies, Jack found himself repeatedly drawn to Emma, who sat beside Rebecca with remarkable composure. She watched, each speaker with solemn attention, her small face reflecting an understanding beyond her years. When Judge Parker finally requested that she approach the bench, Jack felt an overwhelming urge to protect her from this burden, a feeling he suspected George Miller might actually share, judging by the flicker of discomfort that crossed the older man's face. "Miss Emma," Parker addressed her kindly, "I understand this is difficult, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. You've lived both with your grandparents and with your mother and stepfather. Can you tell me about those experiences?" Emma stood straight, her voice small but steady in the hushed courtroom. "Grandfather and grandmother have a big house with fine things. When Papa was alive, we visited for Sunday dinners sometimes." She hesitated. "But grandmother always said children should be seen and not heard, and grandfather was usually busy with ranch matters." Her expression softened as she continued, "With Mama, I'm always heard, and with Papa Jack, I learned to track animals and whittle wood and be brave even when things are frightening." She glanced toward Jack with a trust that humbled him. "He saved us when the snow was deep and no one else came. He taught me that actions matter more than words." Parker nodded thoughtfully. "And if you could choose where to live, what would you prefer?" "With Mama and Papa Jack," Emma answered without hesitation. "We have a garden started and books to read and neighbors who smile now instead of whispering. Grandfather would make me wear fine dresses and sit still and not speak at dinner," she added with devastating simplicity. "He didn't want us when Papa died. He only wants me now because he's angry." A murmur rippled through the courtroom at this assessment. Jack noticed Martha Miller's hand move briefly to her throat, her composure faltering for the first time as her granddaughter's perception of their relationship was laid bare. George Miller's testimony followed, his commanding presence filling the courtroom as he outlined his concerns with practiced authority. He characterized Jack as an opportunist, Rebecca as emotionally compromised by grief, and presented himself as the only suitable guardian for his son's child. Daniel was groomed from boyhood to manage Silverwood Ranch, he declared. Emma, as his only child, deserves the legacy he built. She requires proper guidance to prepare for that responsibility, not the uncertain existence of a former schoolteacher married to a mountain recluse. When Parker inquired about the circumstances of Rebecca and Emma's departure from Silverwood, George's explanation was noticeably evasive. "Winter arrangements are always temporary," he claimed. "Rebecca misunderstood our intentions. The cottage was Daniel's bachelor quarters, never meant for permanent residence." The testimonies continued through the morning, Andrew Miller speaking eloquently about his brother's independent spirit and clear intentions regarding the insurance policy, Martha Miller offering a stiff but not unkind assessment of Rebecca's suitability as a mother. The business associates providing carefully curated recollections of Daniel that Jack suspected bore little resemblance to the man Rebecca had described. By midday, Judge Parker called a recess, instructing all parties to return in 1 hour for his ruling. The tension that had built throughout the morning followed them into the street, where townspeople gathered in hushed clusters, debating the likely outcome. Jack guided Rebecca and Emma to Wilson's Mercantile, seeking respite from the public scrutiny. Maggie welcomed them warmly, ushering them to the private living quarters behind the store, where she had prepared a simple meal. "You all need sustenance," she declared, placing sandwiches before them. "Especially you, Emma. You showed more backbone in that courtroom than half the grown men in Riverdale." Emma managed a small smile at this praise, though Jack noted her unusual quietness as she picked at her food. The strain of the morning had clearly taken its toll, despite her remarkable composure. "You did well, little one," he told her quietly. "Spoke your truth clearly." Rebecca smoothed Emma's hair. "Whatever Judge Parker decides, I'm immensely proud of you. Your father would be too." "What if the judge makes me go with grandfather?" Emma asked, voicing the fear that had surely been haunting her. "What if I never see you again?" Jack exchanged glances with Rebecca, both reluctant to offer false reassurances. Before either could respond, Andrew entered the Mercantile, his expression cautiously optimistic. "I've just spoken with Judge Parker's clerk," he said. "The judge has requested Daniel's letter be brought to his chambers. That suggests he's giving serious weight to Daniel's expressed wishes." Rebecca's hand found Jack's beneath the table, her fingers cold with tension. He enveloped them in his warm grasp, offering what comfort he could in this moment of uncertainty. When they reconvened in the courtroom, the atmosphere had intensified, anticipation palpable as Judge Parker took his seat. He arranged several documents before him, his expression revealing nothing of his decision. Having considered all testimony and evidence presented, Parker began, this court must determine what arrangement best serves the welfare of Emma Miller. Such determinations require balancing multiple factors: blood relationship, financial, security, emotional well-being, and, when possible, the expressed wishes of the child herself. He turned his attention to George Miller. Mr. Miller, your petition emphasizes your superior financial position and blood relationship to Emma. These factors carry weight, as does your long-standing position in this community. George straightened, almost imperceptibly, a hint of satisfaction crossing his features. Jack felt Rebecca tense beside him. However, Parker continued, this court cannot ignore troubling aspects of your conduct following your son's death. The evidence suggests you provided minimal support to your daughter-in-law and granddaughter during their period of greatest vulnerability, effectively rendering them homeless during harsh winter conditions. Parker held up Daniel's letter. Furthermore, your son's written statement clearly indicates his desire for Emma to remain in her mother's care, with financial provisions specifically arranged to ensure their independence from your control. The judge turned to address Rebecca. Mrs. Thornton, while your hasty remarriage raised initial concerns about stability, the testimony regarding Mr. Thornton's character and your mutual commitment to Emma's welfare has been compelling. The child herself speaks with remarkable clarity about her preference and her reasons for it. Parker folded his hands before delivering his ruling. Therefore, it is the finding of this court that Emma Miller shall remain in the primary custody of her mother, Rebecca Thornton, with full parental rights extended to her stepfather, Jack Thornton. The insurance funds established by Daniel Miller shall be held in trust for Emma's education and maintenance, administered jointly by Rebecca Thornton and Andrew Miller as trustee. Relief washed through Jack like a physical force. Beside him, Rebecca's composure finally broke, tears filling her eyes as she clutched Emma's hand. Parker wasn't finished. However, recognizing the importance of maintaining family connections when possible, this court orders that Emma shall visit her grandparents at Silverwood Ranch one Sunday each month, provided such visits are conducted respectfully and with consideration for her emotional well-being. This final provision surprised Jack, though he recognized its wisdom. Despite George Miller's actions, maintaining some connection to Daniel's parents would be important for Emma's sense of identity and heritage. As Parker adjourned the court, the room erupted in conversation. George Miller rose abruptly, his face flushed with anger or perhaps embarrassment, and strode from the room without acknowledgement. Martha lingered briefly, her gaze finding Emma, with an expression Jack couldn't quite interpret before following her husband. "It's over," Rebecca whispered, disbelief and relief mingling in her voice. "She's safe." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "We're all safe now." The following weeks brought remarkable transformation to their household. With the Miller petition dismissed and Jack's past actions officially recognized as self-defense, the cloud that had hung over their future gradually dispersed. Riverdale's initial wariness toward Jack evolved into cautious acceptance, then genuine respect as residents witnessed his quiet industry and unwavering devotion to his new family. Spring arrived with particular sweetness that year. Jack helped Emma plant the garden she had dreamed of during their mountain confinement, vegetables for practicality, wildflowers for beauty. Rebecca resumed teaching, converting their front room into a classroom 3 afternoons each week, her natural gifts flourishing as local children gathered to learn reading and arithmetic. The monthly visits to Silverwood Ranch proved less difficult than anticipated. George Miller maintained a cold formality, but refrained from outright hostility in Emma's presence. Martha, surprisingly, showed tentative interest in her granddaughter's activities, even requesting Emma bring samples of her schoolwork and gardening achievements. As for Jack and Rebecca, their marriage of necessity had evolved with quiet certainty into something neither had anticipated when snow and desperation first brought them together. The respect that had formed their foundation deepened into genuine affection, then blossomed into love. Not the impetuous passion of youth, but something more enduring, built on shared purpose and mutual trust. One evening in late May, Jack sat on their porch, watching Emma demonstrate her newfound skill with a jumping rope. Rebecca beside him, mending a torn page in one of Emma's books. The domesticity of the scene struck him with sudden force. This, life so different from the solitary existence he had known for 9 years in his mountain cabin. "Having second thoughts?" Rebecca asked, noticing his pensive expression. Jack shook his head, his gaze returning to her face. This woman who had brought him back from exile in more ways than one. "No regrets," he said simply. "Just gratitude." Rebecca's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with familiar comfort. For someone who claims to have little use for words, you occasionally find exactly the right ones. Emma called for their attention, demonstrating a new jump pattern with impressive coordination. Jack applauded appropriately, marveling at how this child had carved a place in his heart without effort or design. Later, with Emma asleep and the house settling into nighttime quiet, Jack stood at their bedroom window, gazing toward the distant mountains still visible in the fading light. The cabin remained there, a sanctuary he occasionally visited to check traps or collect possessions, but no longer his home. Rebecca joined him, following his gaze. "Do you miss it? The solitude?" Jack considered the question with his usual thoroughness. "Miss certain aspects," he admitted. "The quiet, the simplicity." He turned to her, this woman who had become the center of his reordered world. "But gained far more than I lost." Rebecca's smile held a depth of understanding that needed no verbal response. Instead, she leaned against him, her head resting naturally against his shoulder as they watched darkness gradually claim the mountains. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would surely be many in this life they were building together, Jack knew with bone-deep certainty that the path leading from that snowy night at Rebecca's cottage had been the right one. Not easy, not direct, but ultimately leading exactly where they were meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.